Welcome everyone to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest. I'm David Margolin. Today is September 15th, and we're still forecasting CDDs. In terms of today's, excuse me, and we'll continue forecasting CDDs until the end of the month. We'll switch over during the first forecast period that coincides with October, which will be soon. In terms of today's agenda, we're going to do, we'll start with attribution. We'll talk about recent forecasts, including the most recent verification, which you can see on my screen. Then we'll go into the forecast process, or today's forecast. And also, we had a question earlier about the MJO, and basically maybe a little bit of more background about what the MJO is and how how to utilize it in terms of the forecast process. And I don't think there's a one answer, or just one approach. But maybe we can have, again, a couple of volunteers talk about how they use the MJO as part of their forecast process. All right, any other agenda items before we jump into it today? If you think of anything, let me know. Again, we should have a little bit more time today because we don't have any guest hosts, any official guest hosts here today. All right, so, the attribution. So this was, I took a sneak peek before, and this is definitely an interesting forecast period here. So the verification, let me see if I can shrink my screen with too many. We might have to think about, I don't know, getting a filter for some of these inputs. But hopefully you guys can see, I know I shrunk the font size here a little bit, or the screen size. So the verification's all the way at the bottom. We came in at about 33 CDDs. And the 10-year normal, to put that in perspective, is about 39. And the 30-year normal was about 32. So we came in just a nudge above the 30-year normal, which has been, which is, in recent years, it's a challenge, right, to have a forecast verify cooler or lower than the 30-year, but we came close. In general, it was a tough period in terms of performance for a couple reasons. One, because, just a lot of the forecasts were warmer in general than that. I don't know, let's see, were any human forecasts? Yeah, Dr. Lupo was a little bit cooler than that. And then Dr. Decker was in terms of human forecast, was the closest in terms of warmer, but, not that far away at 35. So, and also the way the CRPS works is it's benchmarked to the 30-year normal. And the 30-year normal was almost a perfect forecast. It was very close. So it resulted in some tough CRPS scores because of that. And what also struck me is this, I'm not going to, let's just go right to it, is the verification versus some of the model forecast, right? We don't, by the way, we are adding the ECMWF maps and the CFS maps, but I don't think we started archiving them this period. So if I click on the ECMWF, I think it'll come out with a blank map. Yep. But next week you should start to see those. All right, but let's look at what the verification period looked like in Dynacast. So we'll go, what did I say? This is the 9th to the 13th. I thought this was an impressive period. Of course, this was, we had all that cold and snow in the west. So there's the 9th through the 13th, and there's the configuration, right? This is temperatures first, with the warmth in the northwest, massive cold. That's an adjective for it. I don't call it what you want, but really strong, highly anomalous cold for this time of year. Snowstorms or snowstorm in parts of Colorado, Wyoming, areas like that, and still some pretty good warmth, for sure, anomalous warmth across the eastern states. In terms of where what the pattern forecasts were, this is the report from Maxar's report from August 25th. So the same verification period, the 9th through the 13th. You've got the Maxar forecast in the top left, and the ECM and CFS patterns over here on the right side of the page. So you know, it was. I think Maxar would agree that this was a tough one for them, right? You know, obviously they had some aboves in Colorado and areas that actually experienced some, you know, highly anomalous cold. So the pattern did not work out there. So, you know, again, for you know, folks who like Brandon, who are, you know, making these forecasts for the first time and finding this challenging, well, guess what? You're not alone. You know, forecasters who have been doing this for 10, 20, whatever years, um, you know, struggle to in some of these situations. This is a perfect example where, you know, the 16 to 20 forecast in particular, you know, getting out to the 16 to 20, even the 11 to 15 and 6 to 10 in some cases, you know, there can be some significant errors. And this was a perfect case. You could see arguably the EC and CFS. Uh, well, I mean, not really the CFS, right? We know that the eastern parts of the country had very anomalous warmth. So I won't give the CFS a good grade. Maybe you give it a passing grade, a D or a C, because it had some cold in the middle and it had some warmth in the northwest. But you know, not great, right? Not an A or a B. The EC arguably was closer, right? I mean, the pattern configuration, if you shift this, you know, I don't know, what is it, another 500 miles, 600 miles to the west, it lines up pretty good. So I would say of the three forecasts here, Maxar, at least from a pattern perspective, right? Maxar, CFS, EC. The EC, you know, was, you know, probably got the best grade in my opinion. This is obviously subjective. It'd be interesting to run like a spatial correlation on this. Just let's take a quick look at what they were saying. Were there any hints of this? Um, the forecast trended warmer in the south. Otherwise, similar warm forecast as previous. Warmth in the west. The eastern half is held closer to normal. The MJO, which is here's a point about the MJO. The MJO, which is forecast to be of low amplitude signal propagating from phase 3 to 4, is a contributor to the forecast pattern. Analogs popped on the screen. Analogs for the tropical forcing are, I guess, consistent. They talk about the AMO and things like that. This produces a period that falls between the cooler 30-year and the warmer 10-year. So from a, you know, from a temperature standpoint, it did fall within the 30 and 10-year. And I know this is something we talk about ad nauseum, the fact that sometimes you're right for the wrong reasons, or you're kind of right in terms of a number for the wrong reasons. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than to be good, kind of thing. And maybe this is the case, right? That the number, not too bad, arguably, but the spatial pattern, you know, was a tough one. I want to turn it over. I think Dave D'Arcangelo jumped on here, and you know, Dave makes these kinds of forecasts for his job. Dave, I wonder if you want to chime in here and have any thoughts in terms of, you know, what happened here, and you know, were there signs that you saw that at least hinted, even if it wasn't a centerline view, did you see signals out there that said, you know, that something like what verified here, where I have that, you know, could come to verification?
Can you hear me, Dave?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. So there were a few hints. You know, it's been an unusually quiet year in the Western Pacific, and in this late summer, early fall window, that's an area that we watch for typhoon activity that might tip us off to potential downstream changes. And albeit a quiet year in the West Pac, we did have two notable typhoons several weeks back, and they seemed to have been a catalyst for these changes. I think this week was an interesting example because those typhoons, which actually followed somewhat similar tracks, they were formed rather far west in the West Pac and kind of rode west-northwest and then due north, like right up over the Korean Peninsula and into far northeast China. They did seem like they ignited some downstream changes by kind of obliterating the long-standing ridge in the North Central Pacific, which had been kind of a summer-long feature. And so once we've had that change, there was this idea that there could be the risk for much colder eastern North America. Now, the interesting thing about this was that, we got the extreme cold to come in. And obviously, this was a huge error in placement. But I think the typhoons were a tip-off that, we were going to kind of finally disrupt what was a rather prolonged, going back to June, stable pattern of broad ridging across much of the United States. But I think that the location of it was obviously the biggest challenge, and that often is when you're trying to see changes across more than a wavelength in the pattern. Then obviously we could see some difficult challenges with that. This was also a window where we were starting to get the Atlantic to ignite. There was a fairly vigorous area of upward motion which moved across the Atlantic. And we've kind of set off the first of those few storms, which was last week, was Paulette and Renee. The ideas for Sally forming were already present. But I don't think we really anticipated how kind of busy this window was going to get in the Atlantic. We saw it was going to be a fairly active period, but it's got substantially active. So that may have been what thwarted that cold back into the kind of the interior West, Rockies and the Plains, and kind of allowed that southeast ridge to hold firm. But again, those are challenging things to see, a week to 10 days out, never mind 16 to 20. This is also, I think, a good reason why we like to think in terms of what is the probability risk. We typically, in my company, we typically don't show just a map or come up with a single CDD outlook. And we like to think in terms of what is the probability distribution of possible outcomes. And I know that we were still tilted warm that week, but I think we were trying to apply a little bit greater weighting to some colder scenarios. Now, that colder scenario never really panned out because we were painting it more across the Great Lakes, Midwest, and Northeast. And obviously it was much more centered Minneapolis to the interior Southwest. So the timing, the idea that we could see a timing change and a change towards cold was right. But again, you're right. The verification just looks atrocious when you can see the verification map.
Thank you, Dave. Any before we continue on, any questions for Dave about his analysis there? I thought that was I think we always try to, when we hear important points or sort of provocative ideas or what have you, always kind of look at opportunities for maybe a research study. And I think the thing that jumped to mind in terms of what Dave just shared with us was, we could certainly, someone could certainly try to look at forecast performance with respect to, some of that typhoon activity that Dave was talking about, right? And some of this obviously work's been done in literature, but we could look at it more with respect to, industry in terms of HDD spikes or CDD spikes and things like that, or just changes. It'd be really interesting to just pull from the last 10 years situations that, analogs where maybe you had those typhoons recurving or typhoons out in the tropical Northwest Pacific, and to see if we did see a heightened amount of model volatility, something along those lines, 10, 15, 20 days out from that. That's something that if someone had some interest in, perhaps we can take a look at that. All right. So challenging, right? Challenging forecast here. Let's see. We can take a quick look at the summer as a whole, and then we can move on. All right, so I think these are the latest and greatest in terms of directional hit rate. Yeah, I think Paul Roundy is still kind of leading the way, at least with forecasting in nearly all of the events or all of the forecast dates. He's at 94%. One of the new students here, Nick, is also doing quite well He's forecasted 10, and he's 10 for 10 so far. So good job there. In terms of overall, or I'm going to look at rankings in terms of consensus. Um, and let's see, Nick's the leader so far. It's been difficult to beat consensus, as you can see up here. That's Maxar, industry number one. So Maxar has done quite well here, and they participated in all the forecasts. And again, Paul Roundy is also near the top. You can see the dynamic guidance near the bottom. So in particular for the CFS, not a good summer so far, at least with the data that we have. Again, we're only picking dates one day a week. So, you know, keep in mind the sample size. And the ECMWF also not exactly a banner year, right? In terms of performance. With the caveat with both of those, you know, again, Nat Johnson did a really interesting analysis a couple of weeks ago. He shared it. I think it's, I don't think I added it up here yet, but we did tweet it out, and he looked at like a bias corrected CFS, and the results were really interesting when you did that. It was quite a bit better and much more competitive. So that's something to take a look at, and hopefully at some point we can get that into our forecast here. Before we move into our sort of weekly table, before we move on to today's forecast, does anyone have any other thoughts or comments with respect to attribution? All right, so let's look at today's forecast. And yeah, we've got some new folks here from the University of Missouri. They've chosen some fun names. So if you see some new names, that's we have these small groups that are participating in the contest, or it's part of Dr. Lupo's Subseasonal Forecast Contest class, and they've kind of broken the class into like 3 or 4 smaller groups, and they get to choose their names. So if you don't recognize some of those names, it's probably from the University of Missouri. But before we jump into all this, so Philip, maybe this is a good time. If you could just give us like a 5-minute or whatever time you need to kind of walk us through a little bit of an explainer on the MJO, and you know, again, just how you utilize it as part of your forecast process. And would you like to have the screen?
Sure, I'll share my screen really quickly. I'll just show like the main pages that I use.
Sure, sure.
Okay. Oh, host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
Yeah, sorry about that. And Brandon, are you familiar with the MJO? Like, would it also be helpful to give you a quick explainer in terms of what the MJO is, or are you more interested in terms of how it's applied in a forecast process?
So I did some research about it, but basically what I know is that it's a precipitation effect in the eastern or western Pacific, but that's about as far as I know.
Okay, yeah. So Philip, why don't you also jump in terms of just a little bit of background
All
on the
right.
MJO?
Sure. So essentially, the MJO signal is this wave that propagates through the equatorial regions, and it's most prominent in the eastern half of the hemisphere, but there's also a signal as it crosses through the Atlantic and into Africa. Everyone can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So essentially, it acts as it basically it takes the I think the way it's calculated is it either uses the A50 anomalies for heights and wind, or it uses like the outgoing long wave radiation, which is a proxy for convection, or it can also use the 200 hectopascal heights instead of the 850. And it's basically, there's different ways to quantify it, but essentially it follows this wave signal that moves generally from west to east across the equatorial regions. And based on different research, there is evidence that the MJO signal tends to affect what happens in the extratropics. And there's a lot of different ways to quantify that. So usually the MJO, as you probably know, goes through 8 phases using the Wheeler-Hendon two-phase diagram. So it basically traces where the signal is in relation to the globe and also the amplitude of the signal. And something that's also helpful is if you look at velocity potential, the green area also highlights where convection is more active. And sometimes I use that as a quick check to make sure that the Wheeler-Hendon isn't just latching onto, say, an arbitrary stationary signal. And there's different ways to quantify how this MJO signal affects things going on in the US. So what I tend to use is, so what I tend to use is this, so dynamical model MJO forecast. This shows sort of what the different models are forecasting for the MJO signal, where it's expected to go. And what I also like to use is, let's see, not this one, this one. So on the CPC website, there's also this lag composites, and it shows basically every phase of the MJO and sort of the composites that you can expect, whether you're looking at 200 hectopascal height or 850 hectopascal temperature. And I think the lags are roughly about a 5-day average. I forget, I have to read that again, but I think it's like a 5-day average, and it sort of shows what kind of signal you can expect to project it onto the CONUS. And so there's different lags. So there's different composites based on the period. So for example, right now, September, October, November, you might expect phase 6 to look something like this if it was within the 5 days of the period that you're interested in, or if it was phase 6 roughly 15 to 20 days ago. And then something else that we also have, which is sort of similar to that, is this MJO analog that was developed for our forecast contest. And what this does is it basically takes where the MJO is located at either a 16 to 20 day lag or up to a 1 to 5 day lag, and then it ties in the CDD anomaly that is expected. So for example, right now the MJO I think is over here in, actually let's move this back. So the MJO is roughly in between phases 3 and 4 right now. And that based on the 16 to 20 day lag marked from September 10, which is actually a few days off from today, but is sort of an idea that would say that 16 to 20 days later, you would expect the CBD anomaly based on this to be roughly close to the 30-year normal. Does anyone want to fill anything in for that?
Just going to say you could show, especially in the winter, right? If you switch over to HDD, some of those signals start to get pretty impressive. Yeah, exactly.
So like this is at a 16 to 20 day lag for say January 1st. So that would be roughly a verification about January 16 to 20, that period. And you can see that there's some fairly high values of HDDs that you would expect, say if the signal was in phase 2 on January 1st, then probably say 16 to 20 days later, you'd expect an HDD anomaly of minus 10 to 15, which is a warm signal. And on the converse, if you had, say, the signal in phase 7 here, then roughly 16 to 20 days later, you'd expect the signal of about 10 to 15 higher HDD, so cooler conditions.
Great. And do you have any questions for Philip or anyone on the MJO? Does that help?
It does help for sure. I'm just processing it at the moment. So when you say lag, that just means the 16 to 20 days after the current date, the mark date.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's how you could use it in a forecast process, right? So pretend it's, around January 1st right now, December 31st, January 2nd, ballpark of January 1st. This is exactly what you would want to look at to make a 16 to 20 day forecast, because it would, this is going to tell you historically, or it shows you at least historically, the relationship between when, you know, the MJO, or at least the index that is a proxy for the MJO, um, it's going to tell you that response as a function of the phase and amplitude. So, for example, you know, just give another example, like Philip did. If it were around January 1st, and the index was a high amplitude phase 7, like, you know, way up there, almost phase 8, you know, phase 7, phase 8, on those blue dots, those strong, you know, those big blue dots, then that tells you that historically speaking, 16 to 20 days later, you know, there's been a pretty good cold signal, right? Is that 10 to 15?
Right.
That's in the 10, yeah, 10 to 15 HTTs above normal, which is, you know, colder than normal. So,
Right.
you know, you would be thinking, all things being equal, obviously there's other data points, there's other things to look at. It's, you know, but this data point would be leaning you in a cold direction for sure.
Gotcha. And so how do you know what phase? So I've seen it a couple ways where there's forecasts on what phase the MJO is going to be in. Does that factor into it at all? Or is that just even further down the road that that's not even affecting what we're forecasting?
I think it depends on who you ask. I know some people don't like to use the current day and they prefer to look at what the forecast is, in which case you might use the 1 to 5 day lag, say for January 16 to 20 period. You might be interested in where the models are forecasting. Let's say that originally it was in phase 1, 16 to 20 days, and now the model forecasts it in to be phase 4, roughly near the start of the period. Then perhaps you take the 1 to day lag and then use this HDD value from there. And similarly, I also use, like, as I mentioned, the CPC has something similar where instead of showing the exact HDD CDD numbers, it gives you like a spatial distribution of where historically the lags lead to the temperature anomalies at 850 at least. So depending on who you ask, some people say that they don't like using the longer lags because it's accurate. But then if you use, say, lag 0, there's also the concern that the model might be forecasting the signal in the wrong place, in which case using the lag 0 based on the forecast might not necessarily be accurate.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I think, you know, once you start getting a little bit, you know, you initially you kind of get your basics with the MJO, some of the basic relationships. But I like the question you asked, because you start going down this road where it does become a little bit uh, more involved, right? More complex, and then you're going to get, if you ask 10 different meteorologists, 10 meteorologists, you're going to get 10 different opinions. Like, should I be exactly what you said? So I think that's a good road to start thinking about. Another example of that is, well, what if you're in an El Nino versus a La Nina, right? Some meteorologists like to conditionalize the MJO as a function of ENSO state. And you're going to see some different relationships. We don't have that here. Another website might have that, but that's something else to think about. Some meteorologists may even condition it on your extratropics, your teleconnections. Well, what if the MJO is in phase 3 and you have a Greenland block? You know, those are definitely some
Right.
things to think about, and you might want to investigate, and things we can talk about in future discussions. You know, it gets a little bit more involved. And
Mhm.
then certainly what you said in terms of, you know, should I be looking at where it's initialized, or should I be looking at where it's forecast to be? And the last comment I'll say about that is, you'll notice here we have something called the progression filter. No, that gets a
Right.
little bit to what you were saying. Now, I don't think so far we've included in this UI a progression filter, yes. But what that's intended to say mean is, in this case, it says progression filter no, which means we're including it. It doesn't matter if let's say we're looking at one of those points in phase 5. It doesn't matter if 20 days from now it moved all the way over to phase 8. It doesn't matter if it didn't move at all. There's no progression filter. We're using all in all points, right? We're
Right.
agnostic to any kind of progression, slow progression, fast progression. It doesn't matter. This tells you all progression. However, again, as you kind of were alluding to, you might have information on whether it's going to be progressive or not, like really fast or not. And you might think that that really matters. Like, hey, listen, I have good confidence this is going to move from phase 5 to 8. So I want to filter by MGO waves that were, quote unquote, progressive, moved at a steady clip or whatever.
Right.
And again, if I could magically subset that on the screen right now, yeah, you might absolutely see different relationships. So that's another thing to consider, to think about. And at the end of the day, Dave D'Arcangelo can talk more about this if he'd like. At the end of the day, meteorologists in the business, in particular, like if you're forecasting in commodities, things like that, what
Mhm.
you're trying to do is kind of, you know, game the models a little bit, the numerical model guidance. So, the ECMWF or the CFS says this, right? Says whatever.
Yeah.
The one of the main reasons you look at the MGO is because there's a view, and I think it's based on research, and in particular 5 and 10 years ago, but even to some extent now, that the numerical model guidance does not resolve these tropical forcing signals that well. And there may be systematic errors with it. There just may be just general errors. But if you can kind of distinguish the noise there and say, okay, the numerical model guidance says this, all the tropical forcing / MJO guidance says this, and if you can understand where what the numerical model guidance knows about tropical forcing and kind of separate that out, then you can have an advantage. In other words, if you know in a certain situation that the numerical model guidance is not resolving well the MJO, and maybe the numerical model guidance says it's going to be cold, but the MGO guidance, says it's going to be warm. Well, all of a sudden, you might be able to hedge against the market. You might be able to say, you know what, guys, I know all the numerical model guidance is saying cold, but I've got some information that says the risk are more in the other direction. If it's gonna error, if it's gonna change, it's gonna move in that direction, and that's where it can be really valuable.
Gotcha. So last question about this right now is, how do you know what phase the MJO is in? That was one of the websites you had?
Yeah, Philip can help you with that, I think.
So with looking at where the MGO is, the easiest way is to just use the Wheeler-Hendon phase space, which is on the CPC page, and it's also, I think, on the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. They also have a very nice MGO page. So that tells you that now the signal is right here in between phase 3 and 4. But sometimes, because this is basically this is just taking like the EOF, the first two EOFs of the situation in the tropics. So sometimes if you have a signal that's very spread out, or if you have like a very persistent standing wave somewhere, sometimes the signal might get skewed, or it might get mixed with other waves that are propagating through the equator. So sometimes I also check the velocity potential, which also shows you where the tropical convection is more active. So like here you see the green, the lot higher velocity potential. I'm not as familiar with velocity potential, but I know like you can see velocity potential. You also see where the infrared satellite is showing that you have convection over here in the Indian Ocean. So that sort of tells you that the signal is in that area. And then you also see some weaker spots. So all of this gets averaged into the Wheeler-Hendon, which is just a single value. And then of course you can also use the Hofmoeller plots. So for example, like an OLR time on the y-axis and longitude on the x-axis, and then from this you can also sort of see how the anomalies are propagating. So you can sort of pick out, say that there was a wave signal that was traveling from let's see, I think this is September to October. Okay, so it was traveling from September into, well, actually no, I'm reading that wrong, sorry. It's traveling, yeah, so October 2018 is on the top, and September 2020 is on the bottom. So it's traveling from top to bottom. So you might see that the signal is sort of propagating in this direction from west to east as you go further in time. And that's also a good way to sort of gauge where the areas of convection are active, and if there's a coherent wave, or if you're just having something that's more like a standing wave.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
Hey, Dave, can I chime in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a good discussion. I appreciate it. These guys have some pretty strong insights here. The one thing that we like to look at in this, from the MGO standpoint, from an industry standpoint, has already been touched on here a little bit. And I want to reiterate it. Is the MGO is we can look at it in terms of like its three components. Velocity potential is one of them. OLR is another, and 850 millibar wind. Sometimes we like to think we can dissect those three components because they are not always in alignment. 200 millibar velocity potential tends to be a little bit more of a low frequency signal, and I think it's a little bit more of a smooth average over a period of time. I think it gives you a sense of maybe the macro part of the MJO from an hemispheric standpoint. I will say this: two other things. One is it's important to not just diagnose areas of active convection in the MJO, but areas of suppressed convection are equally as important because I think it's the differential often between the two of those is vital in terms of understanding MJO propagation and maintenance. And then lastly, the MJO is often, it's important to look at it in terms of the backdrop of what's the base state. And often in terms of base state, we think of like La Nina or El Nino base state. And I think knowing or understanding the base state at which these MJOs are operating in give us a little bit better understanding of where active and inactive phases can be more likely to set up depending on the strength or lack of strength of that base state. So it's a fairly complicated feature. I think you all have done a very good job of highlighting that. But this really deserves a very deep discussion because then we have to get into the whole practicalities of how we start looking at this from a forecasting standpoint. And like Dave, you said, you can line up 10 meteorologists and get 10 different opinions. That's very true.
Thanks, Dave. And there are some resources, Brandon, on the website too. There's like, weather snapshot, I think, and you can find a lot of these links. And then in the resources tab, we've got links for Professor Roundy. Professor Roundy is an expert in this kind of thing. You can find some interesting stuff there too. So if you want to learn more.
Thank you.
Sure. So, Philip, since you have the screen right now, do you want to kick us off in terms of walking through your forecast?
Sure, although I haven't actually calculated my values, so I don't have a numerical number yet, but I do have my forecast basically done.
Sure.
So, so starting off, as I mentioned earlier, tropical convection is active right now in the Indian Ocean area, which generally agrees with what we see on the Wheeler-Hendon diagram of putting the MJO signal roughly in between phases 3 and 4. And actually the signal sort of is slightly closer to the null phase, but sort of in that vicinity. And taking a look at the forecast, I believe the different models are suggesting that the forecast is going to propagate into phase 6 or possibly back into the null phase. And I think that's consistent across the various models here, with some having a slower progression, some having a slightly faster progression, but overall the same just into about phase 6 by the start of the period, or possibly into the null phase. So if we look at our wonderful composites here, we can see that, is this phase 6? Yes. Phase 6 for September, October, November ends up being a warm signal for most of the US, except for a small area in the Northeast. And this will actually be interesting when we look at the CPC forecast later. And just checking it with our composites, our MJO analog for September, as I mentioned earlier, it's sort of a neutral, or if you look closer into the period, it's a neutral to a warm signal, which agrees with the MJO analog value that we have, and which was, I believe, 18. And then ENSO is currently still running cool. It's not quite a La Nina yet, but it's trending towards a La Nina, and the composites for September, October, November suggest that La Nina temperature anomalies are warm for most of the CONUS. So overall, I treated that as a warm signal for this period. Looking at the CPC, we see that we have warmth expected in most of the western 2/3, and we have actually a pretty large area of cool anomalies expected in east of the Mississippi River, excluding Florida. So I treated that as a only slightly warm signal, so that comes in at a value of 17.4. Now looking at our teleconnections, this is not the page. Sorry, give me a second. If we go to our teleconnections, we see that right now the GFS and the EC model and the Canadian are forecasting the AO to be roughly somewhat positive as we get into the start of the period. The PNA has a rather weird forecast, so I don't know really what to make of this, where it looks like it's running slightly negative or near neutral, and then the GFS ensembles want to suddenly jump the signal up into positive territory to start the period. So overall, looking at our, I think I gotta get rid of the composites, but right now for this period, the NAO signal basically disappears using the statistical correlations in October. So I ignored the NAO signal, and the PNA signal was neutral to slightly positive, and the AO slightly positive. So overall, I treated it as a near normal signal. So that comes in at 16.5 CDDs. The EC has a ridge in the northern conus, and the CFS has a trough in the eastern third of the US. So spatially, the two of them are different, and that translates to quite a difference when we look at the EC versus CFS in terms of their actual 2-meter temperature depictions, with the EC being warm everywhere and the CFS has a warm west, cold east. So my forecast weightings I changed. Basically, I've been weighting the 10-year means a little less as we move closer to the H to D season, and I bumped up my 20-year moving average weighting instead, and I didn't change anything else except to change the CFS to a +8 because the overall lower CDD counts right now. So I think adding +9 is a little too high. And then confidence was slightly below average given recent volatility and high tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic. So I believe the average is 6.5. So my signal would probably be about 6.8 or 6.9. And any questions?
Oh, yeah. Let's say, well, your final number, how will it compare to like the 10 or 30 year again? Like,
I'm expecting, since I haven't actually calculated, I don't know, but looking at what I have here so far, I would expect it to be somewhere in between 30 and 10 year, probably closer to the 30, given that most of these values are not all that high.
okay. All right. Thank you. And
In about a few minutes, once I actually calculate, I'll click submit and it should show up on the page.
okay. Any questions for Philip? All right. Who would like to go next?
I can go next.
Sure. Do you want the screen?
Sure. Let's see which screen this looks like. All right, can everybody see?
Yep.
All right, good. All right, let's see. All right, so good morning, everyone. My forecast was for 20.4 CDDs with an average normal spread of 6.5. Started off with a base value of 20.5 based on my 33 or 30% 30% euro, 70% 10-year blend, and then decreased my value by 0.2 CDDs based on all these teleconnections. I'll go through quick. Already touched a little bit. NAO is forecast to be positive, but had no impact, as Phil already mentioned. The signal for a positive NAO disappears. In terms of temperature, AO again positive, but not really much of an impact yet. Still only in early October. PNA, some of the weirdness Phil mentioned as well with the GFS, kind of half split between going up to positive and going back down to negative. I did kind of push through this issue by using the 14-day verification forecast here. It has been verifying on the positive side, so using that as a baseline, I kind of leaned more towards the positive PNA, which is a cooler signal for the southeast during October. And then let's see. Yeah, so the EPO, pretty strong positive EPO signal. It has been, yeah, okay, so I have it here. It's been doing a little bit better recently. With this recent negative spell, you can see it kind of matches up, except for that one strange outlier there. So I'm kind of expecting this to actually verify now, as has not been the case for the past few months. Hopefully that stays, because I think the EPO is a really good signal. And so putting all that together, I'm kind of expecting a ridge west, trough east kind of deal. Kind of actually have a map here that kind of, oops, that's not going to work. This one. Yeah, so kind of expecting a little something like this, not as pronounced, obviously, because this is later in October this map was made. But you know, it's got the positive EPO, the negative PNA, I think. Um, and so it's kind of shows what I'm kind of thinking the pattern will look like. Not as pronounced though, because this is a little too ridge is a little too strong and the drop a little too strong as well. But um, CPC, as has already been touched on, kind of shows something similar. So I actually increased my CDD value by zero point 0.1 based on this, just because there's so much warmth in the west, and there are not as much cool in the south, since that should be our major CDD producer at this point. Shouldn't be expecting too much from the northern tier of the country in late September, early October. And so that got me to my value of 20.4. Any comments, complaints, questions, concerns?
Yeah, I have a couple questions. And by the way, I could ask this for Phil, but he had a lot of screen time, so I figured I'd share it with you. Um, so I think again, we're in our industry hats here and stuff, right? Like, and I guess I want to know, Michael. Like, listen, the last forecast came in pretty darn cool. This is what's on my mind. I'm looking at the 15-day forecast, right? You can look on the Maxar website. Uh, you know, both model guide, like all the model guides, it's showing a pretty coolish kind of pattern. And I guess I'm thinking to myself, like, what happened to September? And not that you're expected to know the answer for this, but I think back a couple months ago and like, I don't want to. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it was like it felt like the world was confident that September of all the months was going to be warm because September's always warm. Like last 10 years, September's always the warm. You could bank on September. Well, CDDs are forecast this September not to come in that warm. It's, I think almost near the 30 year. If I on the Maxar Dynacast site. All right, so there's a question here, not just me, just, complaining. So my question to you, Michael, is you told me a lot about what's not going to influence the pattern, the PNA, AO. What is going to influence the pattern? I looked, Michael, at the last. If you pull up a surface temperature anomaly map, well, we were looking at the Dynacast. There's a lot of cold air across Canada, and things like that. Does that matter? I mean, is that cold air going to get delivered? Is it a risk that we're going to punch some of that cold maybe into the 60, not just in the next 10 days, but in 60 and 20? It sounds like, what are the risks here? I guess what drove this, and I know these answers aren't easy, right? But that's why we do it. What drove this pattern that I heard earlier? Someone said typhoon. Are there more typhoon risks? Like what drove this recent shift to a colder pattern? And is that going to be with us in the 16 and 20? And if not, why not?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. Okay, so
Most of it was just me complaining and
uh,
whatever. I won't say it. Go ahead.
we all complain. I understand. So I'll try to answer as many of those as I can. As
Well, and
for
by the way, Michael, like, and the challenge here is I don't have a lot of time. So just I need you to give me your succinct answer here in terms of what's going on here, in terms of what got us here and where we're going.
So in that case, short answer as to what got us here. The typhoon recurvature in the Pacific was a curveball. A lot of us saw it coming. I personally wasn't cold enough that week. So, these things happen. Wasn't as bullish on the cold as I should have been. Perhaps that, as for this current forecast, I don't believe there are any recurring typhoons that I've heard about. I'll have to double check on that for you though. Um, and as for any cooler risks, I think that since we're still only in basically early October, it would take a pretty significant event to get the jet to dive far enough south to really heavily bring all that cold in and get a really deep and cold shot. So I think with the pattern configuration, I'm expecting with again the warmth in the west, more of the cool in the east. I think that should help to moderate any CD impacts, since the northern tier of the country, isn't really much of a CDD producer at this point. I think be talking only a couple of CDDs at best, in places like Minnesota and Maine and whatnot, probably through New Hampshire and Vermont as well. But um, that being said, I'm confident that in my forecast, despite there being some cooler risks.
Yeah. So Michael, and again, I'm picking on Michael, but this is what we do, right? So you definitely don't want to come into that discussion saying, hey, I believe that the typhoon was the cause for this, recent, for the forecast to really, come in a lot colder across Western states, blah, 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 and then not be sure about the current situation, right? That's that's the first thing you want to do, right? Like, uh, to have looked at the real time information and to be able to say, yes, I don't see a typhoon right now, or yes, I do see a typhoon, or you know what I mean. You want to be able to
Yeah,
address that head on, right? If that's what you believe, if you attribute to the forecast changes, volatility, you want to make sure that when the trader or whoever asks you, that you don't have to say, "Let me get back to you on that." Um, you know, and then the only other thing, again, I just want to drill into this. Could you pull up the? Do you have the Maxar site up, or
yeah. Give me a sec.
so I just want to look at when you get it up. Pull up the go to the composites, if you will. Doesn't really matter, but yeah, and then just pull up select like the GFS op 1 to 5, any of those 1 to 5, just to blow it up, and then switch over to like the once you blow it up, yeah, just like double click on the image, actually, on the actual image, so that it opens.
It's not doing anything
It's
for
not.
me.
All right, just switch over to global view. It doesn't really matter. Switch over to global view, and I just want to make the point. I want to ask you again. Just and by the way, I don't know. It's not an easy answer. Can you click to global view? Um,
Yeah, it
I think the
sounds.
screen froze.
oh, I'm frozen.
Oh. Hold
That's in.
on.
Oh, and I can see you moving a little bit, but I can't see the.
You might have to undo share screen and reshare.
Maybe it's 6. Okay, 12 is just not working. Hold on. Darn technical difficulties. Let's do this one. You see
Bingo,
it now?
perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
So and go to surface temperature anomalies, but this shows it too. And the point I'm just making is when I look at this, yeah, 2 meter, yeah, up a little bit.
This one?
No, up a little bit more. Yeah, 30
Okay.
year or 10 year, doesn't matter. Whatever. Yeah. So when I look at this, like I'm looking like, geez, like all the cold air is across like, North America, eastern half of North America, right? Like, is this locked in? Like or something like this. Is this present cold risk? Like, is this built in? Is this are the models resolving this well? Should I be colder? And so, I'm a crazy trader. I'm asking you this question. Uh, I'm just looking at a map and I'm seeing blue all over Eastern North America. I'm freaking out. Is this locked in? Again, what was your, and I know I'm being a jerky trader here, but what's your answer to that? Like, should I be more worried about cold risk or not, or what are your thoughts?
So I would say that it looks like the East will be in a cooler pattern, at least for the foreseeable future. As for all these blues, I wouldn't worry too much about that at the in the 16 to 20 range. Mainly, let's see. Yeah, so it kind of actually looks like it doesn't like it. But so I wouldn't worry too much about it, just because uh, those areas are not high uh, high demand areas for CDDs in early October. That would be my answer. I don't know if that answers the question though.
Yeah, I think you kind of broke it up into two. I think you could maybe just explain that a little bit better, but I think I get it. There's one aspect of it is, even if that pattern holds, uh, you have to consider the CDD impact. Okay, that makes sense. And then the other is, and it's fine to say that. Like, I think what you're saying is, no, I believe it's going to be more transient. I don't think it's going to be persistent. And you might, and I'm not saying you should say this. I'm just saying, you might say something because you talk a lot about the teleconnections and stuff, rightfully so. And so you might say, you know what, listen, if we had a negative NAO in place or a really massive EPO ridge, I might be thinking has some persistence to it based on my experience or whatever. But because I don't see a negative NAO, and because of this, I think it's more. I do think it's more likely to be transient. So, just because you have this cold on the 1 to 5 doesn't mean that you should necessarily overweight it. That you should expect it to be locked in. Again, I'm not saying you should say it that way or that you believe that, but that is, I'm just giving you sort of a sense as to how you could answer that question, if it fit your narrative.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you. I know we're just about out of time, but I think this was good. I think it was good to drill into some of these topics and stuff. And we'll probably have to leave it there. But before we end it, does anyone have any other parting thoughts or comments or questions?
I just had a one, Dave. When after I submitted my forecast, I checked Maxar's energy report,
Mm-hmm.
and on their page they have the 30-year normal for the 16 to 20 outlook at 27 degrees, and the 10-year at 20, which differs pretty greatly from what's on the WX prediction site.
Yeah, I saw that too. I think what's going on here
He
is
switched.
exactly. So I'll pull it up. What Philip was just saying is I thought they made the move October 1st, but I guess
They switched it.
exactly.
Already.
They
Okay.
switched on us. So now you can see, everyone can see my screen. They already made the move to HDDs, like unofficially.
Okay.
They still provide, and so we get an FTP feed from them, thanks to our friends at Maxar, and so they're still providing CDDs, but in their report, right, they did switch over to HDDs. So, winter's around the corner,
Yeah.
because they've already made the move.
It seems like there's going to be more HDDs and CDDs for this forecast period.
Yeah, what's our there could be, right? Well, Maxar is forecasting, if you believe their forecast, they're lower. They're a lot lower.
Yeah, they are lower. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you're right. The 30-year normal is like what, almost 28 HDDs, and the
Yeah.
CDD normal at this point is lower than that, right? It's, what was it, 22 or
16, I think.
16 or something. Yeah.
that,
15, 16.
oh, is it even that low? I'm sorry. Yeah.
16.4, yeah.
Yeah. So you're right. So, to be frank with you, we could probably switch over sooner. It's just, we usually use a somewhat arbitrary goalpost of October 1st and May 1st. But that's a good point, and that's a topic for another time. And again, this is something David could talk a lot more about. But when you get to the shoulder seasons, September slash, early October and like April and especially into May, you get into that time of year where you have to take into account both HDD and CDD. Some of it's going to depend a lot on geography. Like a classic case of like a high DD, like degree day situation in early May, is when you have a really cold pattern across the northern tier. Like Chicago is like, one of those cold early May days. And it's blistering hot in Texas. And you get that pattern set up sometimes. It's really cold up north, anomalously cold, and anomalously warm in the south. And that's actually the highest energy kind of pattern when you have that set up, because in the north, they're still turning on the heat if it's cold. And in the south, they're turning on the air conditioning if it's hot, and so on. So you get into some interesting kind of scenarios that you have to take into account when you're in the quote unquote shoulder season, September, early October, and April into May.
Hey Dave.
Yeah.
I would say the industry right now is almost entirely concerned with HDDs at this point.
Okay, so that's good. So Dave's basically saying everyone's already said summer's over. We're now all we care about is winter, right?
Yeah. From two standpoints. One is, once we've had some of this cold already occurring, and you're starting to get some nights in the 40s now in the Midwest and Northeast, away from the cities. Once you've cleared out a few of those, no amount of, I shouldn't say no amount, with rare exception, no amount of CDDs at the end of September or early October can cause demand to come back. A lot of operators, or residential locations will have already turned off air conditioning, and that demand will just not come back. I mean, you need like 2 or 3 days getting near 90 to do it. It's much more likely that the industry is very concerned that if you have some nights in the 40s, but the days only get to say 60 degrees or in the low 60s, you're more concerned about a heating demand turning on at that point. So it's already starting to outweigh it. Now, if it had been a hot September up to this point, I would be singing probably a different tune, but it has not been a hot September. Obviously our verification was a bit of a dagger for that.
Yep. All right. Well, that's probably a good place to leave it. So it sounds like we'll be thinking more winter here in the coming weeks. And I think next week we're going to have Carl Schreck. It's either next week or the week after. And for any MGO fans, I definitely recommend tuning in for that. Carl Schreck is also an expert in sort of tropical forcing signals and stuff. So stay tuned for Zach's email. It's either going to be on Tuesday or Friday, but that should be a good one for MGO fans. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next week. Bye, guys.
Good one.